The stagecoach lurched, a final, bone-jarring shudder that seemed to shake the very marrow from Alara's bones, and then fell silent. Dust, thick as buttermilk and the color of rust, settled in a fine film over her worn wool dress, the grit, coating her tongue. For 3 weeks this dust had been her only constant companion, a relentless reminder of the world she had left behind. A world of damp London fog and the suffocating scent of coal smoke. A world where she was nothing more than a burden, a spinster with a barren womb and a dowry long since spent on her father's failed ventures. Out the window, the town of Redemption, Montana, was less a town and more a wound in the vast, unforgiving landscape. A single, muddy street flanked by a dozen or so raw timber buildings, all leaning as if weary of the wind that never ceased its mournful song across the plains. There was no one there to greet her. No smiling, hopeful face of Mr. Caleb Thorne, the man whose letters had been her only lifeline, his words painting a picture of a sturdy homestead, a new life, a chance to be something other than invisible. His last letter, tucked into the bodice of her dress, felt like a block of ice against her skin. I will be on the porch of the general store, Alara. You will know me by the wild roses I hold. A poor substitute for the gardens of England, No, but they are hardy, and they survive, much like us. There were no wild roses. Only the hollow-eyed stare of a few rough-looking men who had stopped their whittling to watch her descend, their gazes lingering with a predatory curiosity that made her skin crawl. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-cracked leather, heaved her single battered trunk onto the boardwalk with a grunt. "This is it, ma'am. Redemption." He didn't wait for a reply, clambering back onto his seat with an urgency that spoke of a desire to leave this place in his dust as quickly as possible. Alara stood alone, the silence of the town pressing in on her. The wind whipped a strand of her auburn hair across her face, and she tasted the salt of her own sudden terrifying fear. Where was he? She clutched her worn reticule, her knuckles white. Perhaps he was delayed. A cow strayed, a fence mended. Frontier life was unpredictable. His letters had warned her of that. She took a tentative step toward the general store, its windows clouded with grime. The porch was empty, save for a splintered rocking chair that moved back and forth in the wind, a lonely, rhythmic creak that sounded like a sigh. A woman in a faded calico dress swept the boardwalk in front of a millinery, her movements stiff and angry, her eyes flicking toward Alara before quickly looking away, a silent, sharp judgment that felt like a slap. The air was thick with more than dust. It was thick with secrets, with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep from the very soil. A low, keening wail cut through the wind, a sound of pure animal grief that came from somewhere behind the main street. It was a sound Alara knew intimately, the sound of a heart being torn from a chest. Drawn by a morbid, inexplicable pull, she walked past the silent storefronts, her boots sinking into the thick mud. The sound grew louder, leading her toward a small, clapboard church with a crooked steeple. A small crowd was gathered just beyond it, clustered around a gaping hole in the earth. A preacher, his face grim and his words lost to the wind, stood at the head of the fresh grave. And then she saw them. 5 of them, standing beside the mound of raw, red dirt, huddled together like a flock of frightened sparrows. The eldest, a boy of no more than 10, stood ramrod straight, his small face a mask of stoic fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Beside him, a girl with hair the color of spun cornsilk trembled, her face buried in the tattered sleeve of her brother's shirt. 3 smaller children, 2 boys and a girl so tiny she could barely stand, clung to each other, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, their bodies racked with silent, shuddering sobs. They were all painfully thin, their clothes little more than rags, their bare feet blue with cold in the damp earth. A man standing near the edge of the crowd, A tall, broad-shouldered figure with a face carved from granite and shadowed by the Fana Fisa. Brim of a dusty hat, turned his head slightly. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met Alora's for a fleeting, searing moment. There was no pity in his gaze, only a shared, bleak understanding of the cruelty of this land. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning, before turning his attention back to the grave. The preacher's voice finally rose above the wind, a hollow, booming finality. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We commit the body of our brother, Caleb Thorne, to the ground. The name hit Alara like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Caleb Thorne. Her Caleb, the man of the letters, the man of the wild roses, the man of her last desperate hope. He was in that hole. The world tilted, the gray sky and the brown earth spinning into a nauseating blur. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a cry, the taste of dust and bile rising in her throat. The man with the storm-gray eyes watched her, his expression unreadable as she stumbled back, away from the grave, away from the 5 small, shattered pieces of the life she was promised. The crowd began to disperse, casting furtive, pitying glances at the children, who remained frozen by the graveside, abandoned once more. The preacher approached them, his face a mask of grim duty. "Come now, children, it's done. The town council has decided. You'll be sent on the morning stage to the orphanage in Helena." The eldest boy looked up, his eyes blazing with a hatred so fierce it was startling in such a young face. "No, this is our home, our pa's home." The preacher sighed, a sound of weary impatience. "Your pa is gone, Samuel. There is no one to care for you. There is no food. The house is barely standing. It is not a fit place." A woman from the crowd, the same one who had been sweeping, stepped forward. "He's right, children. It's for the best." She reached for the smallest girl, her hand hovering, uncertain. The child flinched back, a small, wounded animal. It was then that Alara moved. She didn't know what propelled her, what madness took root in the barren soil of her grief, but she found herself walking toward them, her steps unsteady but resolute. She stopped before the preacher, her shadow falling over the 5 small heads. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. The preacher stared at her, his brows furrowed in confusion. "I beg your pardon, ma'am." Alara drew a breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She looked down at the children, at their starved faces, their terrified eyes, the raw, red grief that mirrored her own. They were his, Caleb's, the only part of him left. "I am Alara, Alara Finch." She held out her hand, not to the preacher, but to the eldest boy, Samuel. "Your father, he sent for me. I was to be his wife." A collective gasp rippled through the remaining onlookers. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The mail-order bride. Merciful heavens, she finally arrived. Too late. Samuel stared at her hand, then up at her face, his gaze searching, suspicious. He saw the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, the raw pain in her eyes. He saw his own loss reflected there. "He's dead," the boy stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I know," Alara whispered, her own tears beginning to fall anew. "Hot and fast, but I am here now." She knelt in the mud, ignoring the ruin of her dress, bringing herself to their level. She looked at each of them, at the fierce defiance in Samuel's eyes, the silent terror in the girls, the bewildered sorrow in the little ones. "I am here now," she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And I am not leaving you." The preacher scoffed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "Madam, you are a stranger. You have no claim to these children, no home, no means. The decision has been made. They go to Helena." Alara rose to her feet, her spine straightening, afire. She didn't know she possessed igniting in her belly. "You would send them away? From their home? From the only place they have ever known? From their father's grave?" Her voice rang out, clear and sharp, silencing the whispers. She turned to face the small, judgmental crowd. Is there not one person in this town with a heart? Is this what you call redemption? Her gaze fell again on the tall man with the stormy eyes. He had not moved, his arms crossed over his broad chest, watching the scene unfold with an unnerving stillness. For a moment, their eyes locked again, and in that moment, something shifted. A flicker of something. Not pity, respect. He pushed himself off the fence post he'd been leaning against and began to walk toward them, his heavy boots making deep imprints in the mud. The crowd parted for him, a silent deference paid to a man who clearly commanded it. He stopped beside Alara, his presence a solid, grounding weight in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He didn't look at her. He looked at the preacher. "The woman is right, Reverend," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. "Sending them off like unwanted cattle is no Christian act." The preacher sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Silas, this is a matter for the council. It has nothing to do with you." The man Silas finally turned his head, his gray eyes fixing on Alara. He took in her tear-stained face, her ruined dress, the trembling hands she had clasped in front of her. Then he looked down at the 5 children huddled behind her, peering out at him with wide, frightened eyes. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of an old, deep-seated pain that he quickly masked. He looked back at the preacher, his jaw set. "It has everything to do with me now." He took a breath, the words falling into the stunned silence like stones into a deep well. "I'll marry her." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ceaseless lonely cry of the wind. Alara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Marry her? This stranger? This mountain of a man with eyes that held the sorrow of a winter sky? The preacher looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth agape, his face a comical mixture of shock and outrage. "You'll what?" "Silas, have you lost your mind? You can't marry this woman, you don't know her." Silas's gaze never left Alara's. It was intense, searching, a silent question that demanded an answer she didn't have. "I know she has more courage than any man here," he said, his voice low and steady. "I know she stood for these children when everyone else was ready to cast them out. That's enough for me to know." He finally addressed her directly, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, my name is Silas Blackwood. My ranch borders this land. Caleb was. He was a good neighbor." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "This is the only way. As my wife you'd have legal standing, a home, a means to provide. They couldn't take the children from you then." Ilara's mind reeled. A marriage. A sham. A contract of convenience spoken over a fresh grave. It was madness. It was unthinkable. But then she looked down at the 5 small faces peering up at her, their expressions a fragile mix of hope and terror. She saw Samuel, his fists slowly unclenching, his young face wrestling with a decision far too heavy for his years. She saw the little girl, Lily, peek out from behind her brother, a single, fat tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. They had nothing, no one, and in that moment, neither did she. Her dream of a life with Caleb had been buried in that red dirt. All that was left was this harsh, brutal reality. And a choice. A terrible, impossible choice. Let them be torn apart and sent away to the cold charity of an orphanage, or chain herself to a stranger and a life of hardship she couldn't possibly imagine. She looked back at Silas Blackwood, at his weathered face, the lines of grief etched around his eyes, the calloused strength in his hands. He was not the man from the letters. He was not the man who promised wild roses. He was a storm, a rock, a desperate, last-ditch solution. He was offering them a chance. He was offering her a chance. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word. A fragile breath in the vast empty silence. Yes, I will. The wedding was a stark, loveless affair held in the preacher's stuffy parlor, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and disapproval. Ilara stood in her dusty traveling dress, Silas beside her, a silent, unmovable monolith. The 5 children were lined up on a horsehair sofa, scrubbed clean but still looking like frightened woodland creatures caught in a trap. Samuel's eyes were fixed on the floor, his jaw tight. Lily clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird, the last thing her father had made her, so tightly her knuckles were white. The preacher rushed through the vows, his voice dripping, with sanctimonious judgment, as if presiding over a sacrilege. When he pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace, just an awkward, cavernous silence. Silas simply nodded, a curt, businesslike gesture, and placed a thin, worn, gold band on her finger. It was too big, and she had to curl her finger to keep it from falling off. It felt cold and heavy, the weight of a life she had not chosen. He then turned, his duty done, and led the strange, broken little procession out of the church and into the muddy street. His wagon was waiting, a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 powerful draft horses. He lifted the smaller children into the back with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, then helped Ilara onto the seat before climbing up beside her. Samuel, refusing help, scrambled over the side and sat with his back pressed against the wagon's edge, staring back at the town of Redemption as if it were an enemy he was vowing to conquer. The journey to the Thorne homestead, now her homestead, was silent. The landscape was a brutal, beautiful tapestry of rolling hills, sharp-edged buttes, and a sky so vast and blue it felt like it could swallow you whole. Silas's ranch, which they passed first, was a sprawling, well-kept operation with sturdy fences, a large, handsome barn, and a 2-story house that spoke of prosperity. Then they turned onto a smaller, rougher track, and the landscape seemed to grow wilder, more neglected. Caleb's cabin came into view, and Ilara's heart sank. It was a small, dilapidated structure, chinked with mud that was crumbling away, with a roof that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The yard was a mess of weeds and debris, a testament to a man's losing battle against both grief and the wilderness after his first wife had died of fever 2 years prior. This was not the sturdy homestead of the letters. This was a place of sorrow, of defeat. The inside was worse. It was one small dark room, thick with the smell of stale air, sickness, and despair. A cold hearth dominated one wall. A thin, lumpy mattress was shoved in a corner, and a few rough-hewn pieces of furniture were scattered about. There was no food in the pantry, only a handful of withered potatoes and a half-empty sack of weevily flour. The children's faces, which had held a flicker of hope, fell. This was the reality of their salvation. A cold, empty house and 2 strangers who looked at each other with the wary caution of wolves. That first night was a blur of misery. Silas, with a grim determination, set about fixing the most immediate problems. He patched the worst of the holes in the roof with spare timber from his wagon, his hammer blows echoing into the twilight. He started a fire in the hearth, the first warmth the cabin had known in weeks, the flames pushing back the oppressive gloom. Ilara, moving as if in a dream, found a bucket and began to scrub. She scrubbed the grime from the floor, the soot from the walls, the despair from the very air. She worked until her hands were raw and her back ached, a frantic, desperate energy fueling her. It was easier to scrub than to think, easier to fight the dirt than the crushing weight of her grief and fear. The children watched them, silent and wide-eyed. They didn't know what to make of these 2 adults who moved around each other with a stiff, formal courtesy, their words few and practical. "There's water in the well. I'll see to the livestock. The little one has a fever." That was Lily. As darkness fell, she began to cough, a dry, rasping sound, and her skin was hot to the touch. Ilara's heart seized with panic. She knew nothing of healing, nothing of caring for a sick child. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with helpless fear. He simply nodded, his face grim. He disappeared into the night and returned an hour later. His horse lathered, carrying a small satchel. "Willow bark for the fever," he said, his voice low. "And a poultice for her chest. My wife was skilled with herbs." The mention of his wife hung in the air between them, a ghost joining the others in the crowded little cabin. He showed Ilara how to brew the bark into a bitter tea, how to mix the herbs with hot water and spread them on a cloth. He did it with a practiced, aching tenderness, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he helped Ilara place the poultice on Lily's small chest. They sat together by the fire, two strangers united in a vigil over a sick child, the silence between them. No longer hostile, but filled with a shared, unspoken anxiety. The days that followed bled into one another, a grueling routine of survival. Silas would arrive at dawn, his wagon loaded with supplies from his own ranch sacks of flour, salted pork, fresh milk from his cow, eggs from his hens. He never said they were gifts. He'd simply unload them and say, "The children need to eat." He taught Samuel how to mend the fences, how to chop wood without losing a finger, his instructions patient and firm. He showed Ilara how to work the soil in the small neglected garden patch, his hands guiding hers as he taught her which weeds to pull and which wild herbs were safe to eat. They worked side by side, rarely speaking, but a silent language began to form between them, a shared glance over a mended fence, a nod of approval at a well-tended row of beans, the quiet passing of a tool. Ilara, in turn, brought a different kind of order to the chaos. She scrubbed and mended and cooked, turning the derelict cabin into a home, inch by painful inch. She washed the children's clothes in the creek until her knuckles bled, patched their rags with scraps of her own petticoats, and cut their matted hair. She discovered that Samuel, beneath his angry exterior, was fiercely protective of his siblings and possessed a sharp, inquisitive mind. She learned that Lily loved stories, that the twin boys, Matthew and Mark, were inseparable bundles of mischief, and that the youngest, baby Grace, would only stop crying when held and rocked. She began to see them not as Caleb's children, but as her own, her family. A strange, broken, patched-together family born of tragedy and desperation. But the process was not easy. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. Nights when she would lie on her thin pallet, the gold band loose on her finger, and weep silent, bitter tears for the life she had lost and the terrifying uncertainty of the one she had found. Days when the children's grief would erupt in raw, painful bursts, Samuel lashing out in anger, Lily dissolving into tears for no apparent reason, the twins fighting with a sudden vicious intensity. There were times she looked at Silas, at his closed-off face and the wall he kept firmly around his heart, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, chaining herself to a man who was as much a ghost as her dead fiancé. He never stayed. The night, as dusk fell, he would mount his horse and ride back to his own empty house, leaving her alone with the 5 children and the ghosts that haunted the small cabin. It was a clear, unspoken boundary. This was a business arrangement, a contract, nothing more. The town of Redemption watched, and it whispered. When Ilara went to the general store for the first time, Silas at her side, the conversation stopped. The women turned their backs, their disapproval a palpable force. "Bought her right at the graveside," one muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "A barren woman trying to raise another's brood," another hissed. "That's Silas Blackwood. He's a fool. Lost his own wife and child to the fever. Now he's taking on a ready-made tragedy." The words were like stones, sharp and bruising. Ilara felt her face flush with shame, her hands trembling. She wanted to run, to hide. But then she felt a warm, firm pressure on her elbow. Silas. He stood taller, his presence a shield. He didn't glare or issue a challenge. He simply met their judgmental stares with his own steady, unyielding gaze until they looked away, one by one. He paid for their supplies, his voice calm and even, and led her out of the store, his hand never leaving her arm. He didn't speak of the incident on the ride home, but something had shifted between them. He had defended her. He had stood with her. It was a small thing, but in her lonely, fragile world, it felt monumental. Not everyone was hostile. The blacksmith, a burly man with a kind face, always had a warm greeting for them, and his wife would sometimes slip Alara a small bag of sweets for the children. An old trapper who lived up in the hills showed Samuel how to set snares, providing them with a steady supply of rabbit for the stew pot. These small acts of kindness were like sunlight breaking through the clouds, glimmers of hope in the bleak landscape of their lives. But the judgment of the town, led by the preacher, remained a constant, oppressive weight. He saw their arrangement as an affront to God and decency, and he made his displeasure known from the pulpit. The children felt it too. They were shunned by the other town children, taunted in the street. "Your pa's dead. Your new ma is a mail-order whore." Samuel came home one day with a split lip and a black eye, his face a thundercloud of rage and humiliation. He refused to say what happened, but Alara knew. She cleaned his wounds with a gentle hand, her heart aching for him. That night, she saw Silas talking to the boy by the woodpile, his voice low and earnest. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way Samuel's shoulders, which had been hunched in anger, slowly relaxed. She saw the way he looked up at Silas, not with defiance, but with a dawning, reluctant respect. Silas was teaching him not just how to survive, but how to stand, how to hold his head high in the face of cruelty. Slowly, painstakingly, a rhythm was established. A life was being built. The garden began to produce vegetables, the cabin became clean and warm, and the hollows in the children's cheeks began to fill out. Laughter, a sound Alara thought she would never hear again, began to echo in the small clearing. It started with the twins, their mischievous giggles infectious. Then Lily, who began to smile again, her face lighting up when Alara read to her from the single book she owned, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. Even Samuel would sometimes crack a smile at the baby's antics. One evening, as a soft rain fell, drumming a gentle rhythm on the newly patched roof, Alara was telling the children a story, her voice soft in the firelight. Lily was curled in her lap, fast asleep, and Grace was gurgling happily in a makeshift cradle. The twins were leaning against her, their heads heavy on her shoulders. Samuel sat on the hearth, whittling a piece of wood, a look of quiet contentment on his face. Silas, who had been delayed by a stray calf, stood in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, watching them. He was silent for a long moment, his face in shadow, but Alara saw the look in his eyes. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness, a deep, raw yearning that mirrored her own. In that moment, the wall between them seemed to crumble, revealing the broken, grieving souls beneath. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. He didn't retreat to his usual corner. Instead, he sat on the other side of the hearth, stretching his long legs out toward the fire. "Tell me another one," he said, his voice a low rumble. And so she did. She told them stories of London, of crowded streets and grand buildings, of a world so different from their own. And he, in turn, began to speak. He told them of the land, of the changing seasons, of the eagle that nested in the high buttes. He spoke of his wife Sarah and the baby boy they had lost, his voice thick with an old, unhealed grief. He spoke of his dreams for his ranch, of the life he had planned before it had all been snatched away. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the sleeping children, they shared their stories, their sorrows, their broken dreams. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were two people who understood each other's pain, who had found a strange, unexpected solace in their shared wreckage. The first snows of winter came early that year, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. The cold was a bitter, biting thing, but the cabin was snug and warm, the pantry stocked with the fruits of their summer's labor. For the first time, a fragile sense of peace settled over them. It was a peace that was destined to be shattered. A visitor arrived one afternoon, a man on a fine horse, his clothes too clean, his face too smooth for this rugged land. He introduced himself as Jedediah Thorne, Caleb's younger brother. He had a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He had heard of his brother's death, he said, his voice oozing a false sympathy. He had come all the way from St. Louis to see to the children's welfare. He looked around the small, clean cabin, his gaze lingering on the well-stocked pantry, the neatly stacked firewood. He looked at the children, who had instinctively shrunk back from him, and then his eyes fell on Ilara, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "And who might you be?" he asked. Before Ilara could answer, Silas, who had been in the small barn mending a harness, stepped into the cabin. He filled the doorway, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from tense to hostile. "She's my wife," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as ice. Jedediah's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. "Your wife? How convenient. I come to take care of my own blood, and I find a stranger has already moved in and married. The grieving widow." "She wasn't a widow," Silas corrected him, his voice dangerously quiet. "She was his intended. And she is these children's mother now, by law and by heart." Jedediah laughed, a short, ugly sound. "By heart? The law doesn't care about hearts, Blackwood. It cares about blood. And I am their only living blood relative, their legal guardian." He produced a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "I have a court order from a judge in Helena. I'm here to take custody of my brother's children and his property." The words hung in the air, a death sentence for the fragile life they had built. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. Custody. He was going to take them. He was going to tear their family apart. Samuel stepped in front of her, his small body a defiant shield. "We're not going with you," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is our home. She is our mother," Jedediah sneered. "You'll do as you're told, boy. The hearing is in Redemption in 2 days. The circuit judge is passing through. Be there, or I'll come with the sheriff and take you by force." He turned and left, mounting his horse and riding away, leaving behind a silence so profound it was like the ringing in your ears after an explosion. Ilara sank onto a stool, her legs unable to hold her. She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. "He can't," she whispered. "Silas, he can't do this." Silas's face was a grim granite mask, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire. He knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. His touch was firm, grounding. "He will try," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "But we will not let him. We will fight." The day of the hearing, the church was packed. It seemed the entire town of Redemption had turned out for the spectacle. The air was thick with anticipation, a morbid curiosity. Jedediah Thorne sat at the front with a slick-looking lawyer from the city, both of them radiating in smug confidence. Ilara sat with Silas, the children huddled between them, their small hands clutching hers. The circuit judge was an old, weary-looking man with a face that had seen too much of human misery. He listened patiently as Jedediah's lawyer laid out their case. He spoke of bloodlines, of legal precedent, of the sacred duty of family. He painted Ilara as an opportunistic stranger, a mail-order bride who had swooped in to claim a dead man's property. He painted Silas as a meddling fool, his marriage a sham designed to circumvent the law. He made them sound sordid, deceitful. When it was their turn to speak, they had no lawyer. There was only Silas, standing tall and straight, his voice filling The silent church. He did not speak of the law. He spoke of a promise to a dying neighbor to look after his children. He spoke of the state of the cabin when they found it, of the hunger and despair. He spoke of the work, the sweat, the struggle to build a home from the ashes of a tragedy. He spoke of Alara, of her courage, her strength, her unwavering devotion to the children. The law may speak of blood, Silas said, his voice ringing, with a conviction that silenced the whispers, but it knows nothing of love. It knows nothing of what makes a family. A family is not made of blood. It is made of choice, of sacrifice, of showing up day after day when it is hard, when it is painful, when it would be easier to walk away. Alara did not walk away. I did not walk away. We chose these children, and they chose us. Then the judge asked to speak to the children. One by one, he called them forward. He spoke to them gently, his voice kind. He asked them where they wanted to live. The twins, Matthew and Mark, just pointed at Alara and Silas. With Mama and Pa, they said in unison. Lily, clutching her wooden bird, walked to Alara and buried her face in her lap, her small shoulders shaking. She didn't have to say a word. Her actions spoke louder than any testimony. Finally, the judge called for Samuel. The boy walked to the front, his back straight, his face set. He looked not at the judge, but at Jedediah. "You're not our kin," he said, his voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority far beyond his years. "Kin don't leave you to starve. Kin don't try to steal your home." He then turned to face the judge, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective love. "My pa died, he's gone, but he sent her to us." He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "Maybe he knew we'd need her. She's our mother." And he looked at Silas, his voice thick with emotion. "He's teaching me how to be a man. How to be like my pa was. This is my family, and we ain't going nowhere." A profound silence fell over the church. The judge looked at Samuel for a long moment, then at Alara and Silas, at the way Lily clung to her, at the way the twins huddled close to him. He looked at Jedediah, at the greed and anger tightening his face. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "In my years on the bench," the judge said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "I have learned that the law is a blunt instrument. It is not always equipped to measure the matters of the human heart, but today, I believe it is. Custody of the Thorne children is hereby granted to Mr. and Mrs. Silas Blackwood. This land, this home, belongs to them, to be held in trust until the children come of age." Case dismissed. A collective breath was released in the room. Jedediah Thorne shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. But the sheriff was already there, his hand on his arm, a silent warning. Alara felt a sob escape her, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Silas pulled her to her feet, his arm wrapping around her, holding her steady. The children swarmed them, their arms wrapping around their legs, their joyful cries filling the silent church. The people of redemption, the same people who had whispered and judged, now looked on with a different expression. They had witnessed not a legal proceeding, but a testament. They had seen a family forged not in a church or a courthouse, but in the crucible of grief, hardship, and love. As Alara and Silas led their children out of the church and into the bright, clean sunlight, the blacksmith's wife met them on the steps, her face wreathed in a smile. She pressed a warm loaf of bread into Alara's hands. "For your family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Others came forward, offering quiet congratulations, a nod of respect, a shared smile. The wall of judgment had crumbled. They were no longer outcasts. They were a part of this town, their story woven into its fabric. That evening, they did not go back to the small, crowded cabin. Silas took them to his home. The large, two-story house that had once seemed so intimidating now felt like a promise. It was a house built for a family, with rooms to spare and a warmth that came not just from the fire roaring in the hearth, but from the sense of a new beginning. The children explored with wide-eyed wonder, their laughter echoing in the spacious rooms. That night, after the children were tucked into real beds, their bellies full and their hearts at peace, Ilara and Silas stood on the porch, looking out at the vast star-dusted sky. The silence between them was no longer awkward or strained. It was a comfortable, companionable silence, filled with all the things that had been left unsaid. "Thank you," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible above the chirping of the crickets. Silas turned to her, his face softened by the moonlight. "For what? I did what any decent man would have done." "No," she said, turning to face him. "You did what no one else would do. You saw us. When everyone else saw a burden or a tragedy or an opportunity, you saw a family worth fighting for." He looked down at their hands, his large, calloused one still loosely holding hers. He gently traced the outline of the worn gold band on her finger. "That first day," he said, his voice a low rumble, "at the grave, when you stood up to the preacher, I saw Sarah in you." He swallowed hard, the grief still a raw, open wound. "The same fire, the same courage. I thought my life was over when I lost her and our boy. I thought this house would be empty forever." He looked up, his stormy gray eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw not just sorrow in their depths, but hope. A fragile, flickering hope. "It's not empty anymore," he said. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles, a gesture more intimate, more binding than the rushed vows they had spoken in the church. It was a promise, a beginning, a choice. They stood there for a long time, side by side, two broken souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The house behind them was filled with the soft, steady breathing of sleeping children. They had been brought together by death and desperation, bound by a contract of convenience. But standing there, under the vast, silent witness of the Montana sky, they were no longer just a man and a woman playing a part. They were a husband and a wife. They were a father and a mother. They were broken pieces that, by some miracle of grace, had found a way to become whole. They were home,